Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fight podcast. This is episode 8 of the fantasy stream. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. You can follow me on Twitter, on Facebook, on Locals, all of which are in the description box of this video. Also, you can support me directly on Locals and engage with the channel directly. Again, making recommendations for future programs, etc., etc. So, today is the Battle of Bywater, the last battle within the Lord of the Rings proper. So, as a brief prelude, after Aragorn was crowned king, the four hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, returned to the Shire. They were in the company with Aragorn. I believe it was up until Rivendell. And then they had Gandalf with them until they got to Bree, where Gandalf went to see Tom Bombadil. Along the way, they meet Saruman, and Merry gives him some pipeweed. And little do they know what Saruman has already done and is about to do while they take their leisurely way home. The trip back from Gondor to the Shire is rather leisurely. Saruman gets there pretty fast and makes a mess of things. When they get to the Shire, they basically find that it's run. I mean, it's a kind of like miniature authoritarian socialist society because there's this talk about, giving and taking, and they always just take from the hobbits and then give it to themselves. I think Tolkien is sort of criticizing on a sort of humorous level of the idea of socialism because, of course, these people are ridiculous and they don't know what's going to happen when the Shire is roused. There's gates that you have to pass through, and they're like, what? They took it a totalitarian society, right? Like, do you have your papers? And the hobbits are not having any of this. Frodo is sort of the peacemaker of the bunch, not wanting this to escalate any more than it has to. Sam, Merry, and Pippin are sort of itching for a fight at this point. So let's see who's in the chat. We have Nathan, CJ Hood, and Zero World. Well, hello. Okay, so the battle proper. As they're moving through the Shire and encountering both hobbits, quote, sheriffs who are working for the Sharky, and the sheriffs were initially just a sort of almost like an honorary position. These aren't really people that do anything, but they were doing things for Saruman. They were fleecing the hobbits, and some of the worst types of hobbits joined them in order to then extort from the rest of them, because there's always going to be elements within a community that turn, under the wrong circumstances, such as this. And one of the chief ruffians basically catches wind of this and decides to shut it down. Don't let these hobbits get ahead of themselves. And this is where the conflict, or the conflict proper, starts. He calls Frodo a cock-a-whoop, which was too much for Pippin. He announced he was in the service of the King of Gondor and unsheathed his sword. Merry and Sam did likewise. This was too much for the ruffian, and he ran off. The fleeing ruffians blew horns to call the muster of their men. The hobbits sought to organize a force to resist them. Merry decided the best way to do this was to rouse the Shire. Merry guessed correctly that the hobbits were, 1, very unhappy with the current arrangements, and 2, were too scared unless led to do anything about it. Merry sent Sam to Farmer Cotton. Merry blew the horn of Rohan to raise the Shire. Sam met Farmer Cotton and his 3 lads, young Tom, Jolly, and Nick. They had axes in their hands. They had first thought Sam might be a ruffian, but were glad he was not. Sam told Farmer Cotton they were going to drive out the ruffians. When Sam returned to where Merry was, he found the whole Shire roused. Many stout hobbit lads, numbering over 100, and armed with axes, heavy hammers, long knives, staves, and hunting bows, were present. Some hobbits had lit a fire. Many of the hobbit sheriffs appeared, and when they found out what was going on, all but a few joined the revolt, with the remainder fleeing. Sam found Frodo and his friends talking to Tom Cotton, a.k.a. Farmer Cotton. Frodo asks Cotton how many ruffians there are. Tom says his best guess is about 50 within Hobbiton itself, though they travel around plundering the hobbits so much it's hard to tell. Tom said if you include the ruffians in Longbottom by Sarn Ford, Woody End, Waymeet, Lockholes, and the tunnels of Michael Delving, There may be another 250 for a total of 300 ruffians in the Shire and its outlying areas. Mary asked if the ruffians have weapons. Tom replied they have whips, knives, clubs, and a few bows. Most of the men are not fighters, they're bullies. Tom tells the hobbits that the Tooks rose in revolt first. Pippin says good for the Tooks. So at this point, there is an ongoing conflict localized to Tookland, and the Tooks are archers, and so they're able to basically hunt and snipe at these guys. But other than that, not much of the Shires until now has been doing anything. Pippin then rode off with a half a dozen lads on ponies to Tookborough to then bring reinforcements to Merry. Hobbit sentries announced that about 24 or more ruffians were approaching from Waymeet. Merry hurried away to give orders. Cotton cleared the streets and sent all non-combatant hobbits indoors. The ruffians had no idea how many hobbits there were and did not imagine that any would stand up. This was supposed to be easy. This was supposed to be just another drubbing. The ruffian captain ordered them to disperse. Tom said he wanted them to leave. They were not wanted. The men advanced a step and then stopped. Farmer Cotton was not alone, but illuminated by the firelight was a whole host of hobbits, nearly 200, and all armed. This was the same ruffian who Pippin scared off earlier. Merry told him to leave or he would regret it. The man was not scared. He had a score of fellows with him. He aimed a blow at Merry, but before it could land, he was shot dead with 4 arrows. The body of the men then surrendered. There was no fight. This was not a fight they could win. They were disarmed and imprisoned in a hut that they had made earlier as a makeshift prison. The dead leader was dragged away and buried. Cotton told the hobbits that only a small portion of the total number of ruffians were present in this skirmish. Sam wanted to check on his gaffer. Tom allowed him to, and told him to take a lad or two as well. Merry was setting up sentinels in the outlying villages and guards for the barricades. The next day, Farmer Cotton got news. The ruffians have left Bag End. The gang from Waymeet was bound to arrive soon. After breakfast, a messenger from Tookland arrived giving news. He said the whole Shire is awakened. The ruffians in Tookland have fled south, those that escaped alive. The Thane of Tookland has gone after them to rout them once and for all. Merry then came back from hard riding all night and announced there was a large band of about 4 miles away coming along Waymeet. They were 100 ruffians in all, scorching the land as they marched. The Tooks arrived first with 100 lads. The ruffians, while brave, were unfamiliar with battle and tactics and keeping good order, so they marched in a careless way and with no precautions or reconnaissance. The ruffians came up the east road and did not halt at the Bywater road. About a furlong from the main road, after taking the bend, they found Merry's barricades, which were upturned carts. The hedges on both sides were lined with hobbits. The barricade was defended by hobbits. Merry told the ruffians they were trapped. Some surrendered, but many did not. They were not easily frightened. A score or more charged the wagons. 6 were shot. Some broke through the barricades, killing 2 hobbits. Pippin said they would not get far with Tooks, and other hobbits roused to patrol the entire Shire. The strongest and most determined got out the east side. They cared more for flight than fighting. Several hobbits were slain and others were wavering. Merry and Pippin on the east side charged the ruffians. Merry slew the leader, a man with slant eyes who looked like an orc. With that, the battle ended. 70 ruffians lay dead, along with 19 hobbits. The dead ruffians were placed on the wagons and hauled to the old sand pit and were buried there, afterwards called the Battle Pit. The fallen hobbits were laid in a grave on the hillside. The Battle of Bywater, 1419 by the Shire reckoning, was the last battle fought in the Shire, and the only other battle other than Greenfields in 1147 Shire reckoning. All the hobbits who fought and died there were put on a roll, which was placed in a chapter of the Red Book. The roll was learned by heart by Shire historians, and Merry and Pippin were on the top of that roll. So the aftermath, Merry and Pippin, the hobbits then marched to the Bag End and found Sharky, which they realized was Saruman, not Lotho. Frodo ordered Saruman away, and Saruman had to admit Frodo's kindness robbed his revenge of Saber. Saruman kicked Grima, and Grima, having slashed his throat, being unable to bear any longer his harsh treatment at the hands of Saruman. Saruman dies instantly. The Hobbit archers then kill Grima. The next year, Sam, in order to aid in the restoration of the Shire, spread the soil given as a gift by Galadriel into the air, which blew it throughout the Shire to help everything grow back. They planted the Malaran seed where the old party tree was. So the aspect here is, why does Tolkien have this in here? Well, part of it was he's got a broader notion of the idea that the struggle against evil and evil itself is going to leave scars, and that nobody's going to get away unscathed. And so the Shire, while it wasn't on the front lines and was ultimately saved, you don't actually get away unscathed. There's some damage is done to the Shire, hence the cutting down of the trees, the party tree, the burning of the crops, and the exploitation by the ruffians of the hobbits and their resources. And of course, this is also the moment for which Sam, Merry, and Pippin had been trained. Their whole questing brought them to this point where they just take charge and go. And so the interesting thing is, again, looking at this from a perspective of tactical planning. Again, we see that Tolkien, in this case, but we'll say Merry, because Merry was the commander of this battle, understands quite well what to do. So first of all, the men are probably almost twice as tall as a hobbit. So if you're going to go shield to shield, sword and board with them, that's not going to end well for hobbits. They're almost twice as tall as you. And so with the height advantage and reach advantage, in a sort of melee or grapple, the ruffians would have an advantage. And so at the Battle of Bywater, there's only about 100 ruffians versus 300 hobbits. So Merry decides to not fight them in a sort of pitched battle like that. Instead, he creates a cul-de-sac, right, where he blocks the road with upturned wagon carts, which, of course, using wagons as a makeshift fortification is an ancient strategy. The Chinese under the Han Dynasty, and I think the 1st or 2nd centuries BC, used upturned chariot carts to create a makeshift fort to drive away Xuangnu nomad horse archers with their crossbows. But they ran out of ammunition and were overrun. But if they had kept the ammunition, it would have worked. And in the Western tradition, of course, we have the Battle of Adrianople with the Goths, where while the Romans attacked the camp, and of course the women and children are there as well, they're able to, the men that were left to guard the wagons were able to delay the Romans long enough for the Gothic cavalry to come and sweep them away. So, and then of course you have the Hussite wagon forts of the 15th century, where, time and again, these Bohemian peasants defeated, the best flower of Catholic chivalry. So this is a common, use of a makeshift fortification. And Tolkien, again, shows his understanding of military tactics and strategy, because, the hobbits, they're not going to build these large, masonry or trenches or things like that. And so, and plus they don't have the time, right? This is they're all within a day or two. So you're going to have to do this quick. And then there's hedgerows along the road where he places hobbits. Presumably that's where the Tookish archers went. And it's not stated directly, but that would be the most sensible. And so the hobbits that are on the carts are now at eye level with the ruffians, right? Because if you're standing on a cart, now the height advantage is negated, right? So Merry is now able to channel them into a trap again. So as you go further in, it's just like with the two spurs on Lonely Mountain, which was the Battle of Five Armies, just like the Valley of Helm's Deep at the Battle of the Hornburg. As you go into this narrow tunnel, you have fewer and fewer soldiers can actually hold a position. So again, in the case of the Lonely Mountain, that was a natural occurrence. The Hornburg was a natural occurrence fortified by humans that had been made, millennia before the battle. And then this was basically a makeshift operation. But in all these cases, Tolkien is using the sound understanding that you have, that you want to narrow the front at which the enemy's coming to attack you. And if you do that, then you can make the advantages, even if you're outnumbered. Now, of course, the hobbits were not outnumbered here. They outnumber the ruffians. But the ruffians were taller than them. And so the hobbits sitting on carts could meet them, could actually be above them, actually. So, and they could, throw down, shoot them with arrows and, attack them on their head with staves and axes. So the other thing is, that Mary had reconnaissance, as I mentioned already. Mary made it very clear that they were going to, on the one hand, have sentinels going around making sure that they had up-to-date accurate information on the movements of the ruffians. The ruffians had no such. So since Saruman is the one who's behind all this, going back to the battles of the forts of the Eisen and the Hornburg, Saruman had very accurate intelligence. The problem wasn't his intelligence; it's that all of these eucatastrophes that were going to happen, like the Ents and everything else. But he seems to have either not cared or gotten lax, because he doesn't even, his minions were not nearly as well-oiled a machine as the orcs and the Urukai and Dunlendings that were serving under him before. And they didn't, keep formation. They didn't perform reconnaissance and walked right into a trap. So there's that. It's interesting that Saruman didn't actually do that. And so also they didn't, I guess you could also say that they didn't want to kill all the ruffians. I mean, certainly Frodo didn't. And of course, given that these are men and about twice the size of a hobbit, it's going to be hard, They give him a way out. And so both in the first skirmish with the 24 men and then the big battle with 100, by giving them an out, if they just surrendered, then you were going to limit the scope and cost of the battle, right? Which is a sound strategy as well. Sun Tzu says, don't kill all the other guys. Give them a way out, because if there's a way out, then they might fight for you, but the hobbits aren't going to fight any more battles. So it also reduces. So you could argue that these strategies, which did limit the losses of both ruffians and hobbits, were in part inspired by Frodo, because Frodo says that we don't want this to escalate beyond what it has to. So in that case, we see the utility there, having the conflict shorter and less brutal. The interesting thing with hobbits, right, is that they're short. And so probably the best way they could fight the ruffians is with bows, because you can then use range and distance as an ally. And since hobbits are very stealthy and able to move around, like the Tooks, right, especially the Tooks, you can be, the hunter is now the hunted sort of thing. The other weapons, like clubs and knives, ideally you don't want to be going up against men with those. Maybe if you had like a hobbit phalanx with like pikes or something, but again, they're so small they couldn't have a pike either. Which is again why they were sitting on the carts, because it leveled the playing field, so to speak. The height advantage was negated entirely, if not slightly, in the hobbits' favor. So in that case, we see that Merry, with the help of Pippin and Cotton and Frodo, came up with a very good plan. I mean, basically, Merry does everything by the book, right? You do reconnaissance, you build a makeshift fortification, you create a trap, lure the enemy in, negating his advantages and maximizing yours, and then give the ruffians a way out so that they don't all fight to the death, which would just kill more hobbits. So, as far as that goes, that's, I think, a very again, this whole series has shown us, right, that not only is, again, Tolkien a great fantasy writer, he understands how to tell an epic story, all these complex themes, but he's also a top-notch cartographer. I mean, his word pictures of geography are incredible, and his understanding of the fog of war, his understanding of the weight of decision, his understanding of tactics themselves show you that he really does understand the history of warfare. And since the Middle Earth is essentially a low fantasy setting, sometime with a technological level analogous to the Middle Ages, he's using everything appropriate in that context. So he's certainly very well read with ancient and medieval battle sources, because again, all of this occurs as you would expect. Right now, we have fictional races, we have hobbits and orcs and elves, dwarves. But that being said, given what we know about them and how they differ and are similar to humans, they operate in more or less the ways you'd expect. And especially within these, combat tactical roles, they operate more or less in the ways you'd expect, which is very interesting. And the other thing too that we see with Mary's preparations is that, don't leave things to chance, right? Mary spends all night riding around trying to gather intelligence, and then take everything seriously. It's no joke. You're going to be fighting, these ruffians. And so, he instilled with very little time, this sense of purpose and mission that the hobbits were able to use to win the battle. And so, yeah, it's been an interesting journey. We've finally finished all the battles in the Lord of the Rings. Let's see. We've also got Ryan Young in the chat. If your strength is speed, you may prefer open battlefields with flanking opportunities. Yes, you would. Of course, hobbits are not known for their speed. Rag plays Battle of Mohai 1241-2. The Hungarians use wagons to encircle the camp against the Mongols. Yeah, that was part of their defensive posture. Exactly. Zero World says, "What's next, Todd?" Well, actually, I think what I'll do next is this. There was an interesting episode of Shadiversity. He's a YouTube channel where he talks about what is it? Basically, ancient or medieval fighting tactics. Where they do this, they meet up in real life and they practice with swords and spears and try to. It's a kind of like battle. It's a kind of like historical archaeology where you're trying to figure out how are these things used, and that's his big hobby, right? So he did a video on what would be the ideal weapons for fantasy races. He mentioned the dwarves, the orcs, and the elves. He didn't mention hobbits, and he had to assume some sort of a baseline, which I think at this point I don't know if it was entirely Tolkien. I think he also had some, because now we have with Blizzard we have Warcraft. The way orcs and elves have been portrayed there has really changed the meta. So what I would say is that was a really good episode, and it got me to think about a lot of different how would I argue that these races would perform. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but given the dwarves are shorter than all the other, except hobbits, shorter than the other races, one of the things that they would need is, and this is where I think Tolkien might not have been as accurate, they'd be using polearms, not axes. Because, if you're fighting orcs, then they're the same height as you, in which case that doesn't matter. But if you're fighting men, then you're going to need polearms because they're taller than you. They've got more of a reach than you. Now, while short, the dwarves have strength, right? And so I would expect to see dwarven phalanxes where they go around with spears and pikes. And as we see in history, the main advantage of a formation like that is the stamina of one side over the other and who can push longer. Of course, dwarves are strongest of all the races in Middle-earth, so they would be pretty much invincible in a set-piece battle like that. So, again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but I think that a video sort of like what Chad did is what I'm going to do next, and that'll be fun. Let's see, Rag plays. I'm surprised Aragorn didn't send a small detachment to clear the Shire of ruffians. Maybe Gondor had too many of their own problems, or they just didn't know yet. Well, to be honest, I don't think anybody knew. I don't think anybody knew because the hobbits were sure surprised. So, let's see. Rag plays. There were pikes in the film in Moria. Nice. Oh, in the film, right? Yeah, the Lord of the Rings film. Let's see. Zero World. Looking forward to this kind of theory stream. Yeah. So basically, for me, I'm going to include, the big four: elves, orcs, hobbits, dwarves. And then they're going to be mostly assuming the principles that we find them in Tolkien. So, like, for example, I don't like the idea of Blizzard's good orcs. They're just not orcs anymore. The orcs, as Tolkien envisions them, were once elves. So if you have a good orc, he's an elf now. Like, this, it just doesn't. I don't like Blizzard's meta, right? But the fantasy meta has changed, so I won't assume just Tolkien, because I do think there are other healthy added components to this. And then we'll just look and see, given their racial traits, given what we know about them, broadly speaking from fantasy, with a broadly Tolkien-esque framing, what would we expect them to do? And I think, as I've thought about this question, I've realized that I think there's a few things that Tolkien should have done different. Well, maybe not done differently, but opportunities were missed. Obviously, the dwarves using pole arms, that's something you would expect to see. Again, not necessarily against orcs, because they're the same size, same height, so you don't have to worry about somebody being taller than you. But they're as we read with the Battle of Dale, as we went last week. The issue is, the men can really jack you up. I mean, the Easterlings had Lonely Mountain encircled under siege. In fact, they only withdrew after hearing of the defeat at the Black Gate. So maybe the reason why the dwarves got stomped by the Easterlings was they didn't have polearms, because the Easterlings, have 2.5 feet over them, and they can just, use, bring all sorts of pain on the dwarves, and there's not much they can do about it. Which is also interesting too to think about, the fact that the evil men seem to be Here's an interesting. The ruffians are a bit of a joke, and so the hobbits just kind of take out the trash. But as we've mentioned, especially with with Mordor and the Battle of Pelennor Fields and the Black Gate and the Battle of Dale, it's the men, the evil men, that are the most effective fighters for Mordor. And I think that's interesting because ultimately, I think Tolkien's saying something here. The orcs are a corruption of something that was good, the elves. So they're inferior by nature of that. But the evil men are twisted in their allegiances, but they're still men. So they have an innate advantage over the orcs. But for the point of view of Sauron and Saruman, orcs are preferable in many cases because they're easier to control. Right? So I think that's interesting, though. His idea that the evil men are the ones that really are the hard fighters is kind of reversed here. Now, Dunland, the men of Dunland don't do much in the Battle of the Hornburg, at least not in the text. They were there and they did some fighting, but most of the actual descriptions are about orcs and Uruk-hai. Let's see, Zero World. Is there any information on various things like architecture, religion? Do you mean for Middle Earth? If so, I don't think so. Rag plays. I get the feeling the East is a lot harder to defend. The Selduin and all the rivers and flat land. Yeah. Well, it's flat, right? So earlier in their history, the Easterlings were riding chariots. They were called the Wain Riders. And of course, Rohan came out of Rehovian, which is that northern area, which is flat. Earl the Young, and then they settled in what was then Rohan. So, well, that's another thing, right? We have all this flat land out east where, there were the Haradrim cavalry, as we mentioned in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, but you don't really see Mordor using a lot of mounted troops. They're mostly, you think of like the legions of orcs and the trolls and the half troll men and all that stuff. And I'm like, well, wouldn't Sauron you be using more horses because it's so flat? You'd think that he'd want to be using that. So let's see here. Zero World. Would be interesting to hear more about some of the more minor things that make up the universe of the Lord of the Rings. Yeah. Rag plays. Really, the Lonely Mountain was the natural place to retreat to. Yeah, it was. So to have the Lonely Mountain completely encircled, there must have been a horde of Easterlings. When before the Battle of Five Armies developed, and the elves and the men were considering encircling the citadel, they said that if Daeon's troops had got there first and got inside to garrison it, they had too few men to actually encircle and blockade the whole mountain. So there was maybe at most 3,000, including Dane's dwarves. So, the Easterlings must have been a horde to encircle the mountain. So that's crazy. But all right, everybody. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise It Folly podcast, signing off.